We continue now at the top of Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph in Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 13a. And the previous Amud, the Gemara was trying to figure out what the Mishnah was talking about when the Mishnah makes a distinction between finding a star that has achrayas nechasim and finding a star that does not have achrayas nechasim. And the Gemara had explained that what the Mishnah is talking about is a situation where you know the star is kosher because the lova admits that he owes the money. But the issue is that when you have a star that has achrayas nechasim, we're afraid maybe the star was written at one date, but the loan took place later. And so therefore, because of the fact that the star has an earlier date, you're going to use that earlier date to collect from Lakuchos. You're essentially going to collect unjustly from Lakuchos, and that's why if it has achrayas nechasim, it's problematic to return it, and if it does not have achrayas nechasim, it is not a problem. But the Gemara asked, how can you say that that's what the Mishnah is concerned with? We have another Mishnah that says that we're allowed to write a star for a lova even though the malva is not present. Why don't we have the same concern over there? We should be concerned that you're going to write the star now, but the loan will only take place later, and therefore you'll go by the date on the star, and you'll collect from Lakuchos Shelo Kedin. And the Gemara now says, Ravasi answers that Mishnah that says you're allowed to write a star for a lova when the malva is not present, that's by a specific kind of star, B'shtari Hakna. It's what we call Shtari Hakna, which Rashi will explain in a moment, to Ashibet Nafshi, because over there what he's essentially saying is from this point in time, there is a loan regardless of when the loan takes place. Rashi explains, B'shtari hakana shemakna lo nechasav mehayom. He's being makna his property to him today, bein yilva, bein lo yilva, whether there's a loan, whether there's no loan, yigme mehen lo oso zman mehayom. The collection will be based on this date. And so that's why you're allowed to write a star for the lova when the malva is not there. It's only by shtari hakana. But the Gemara says if you say that, if so, masnisin. So let's go back to our Mishnah. Again, it says that if there's a lien within that star, so then you can't return the star. Then we understand that the Mishnah is talking about where the lova admits that it's a kosher star. So therefore, why can't you return it? So the reason we gave in the previous Amud was because we're afraid maybe it was written that the loan should be in Nisan, but the loan actually took place in Tishrei. Again, you have the wrong date. You're going to come to collect from Lakuchos, and it's going to be unjust. But the problem is now as follows. Why can't you return such a star? Let us see. If it's a star hakna, so that's not a problem. Then from the moment the star is written, he's already been mishabed himself. There already is a lien, so there's no problem in that case, even if the loan took place later. And ibishtar de lo hakna. Now, if it was a star that's not a star hakna, so then then there shouldn't be a concern anyway. Because you just said that when the lender is not there, you don't write a star unless it's a star hakna. So you're never going to be in such a situation. And so the Gemara continues, Amarle Ravasi said to him, Afal gav the star de lav hakna, even though it's true what we just said, that a star that's not a star hakna, kileka malva bahadei lo kasvinan, when there's no lender present, we generally won't write such a star, so you would think there wouldn't be a concern, but still there is a concern in our Mishnah, Masnisin, because in our Mishnah, Kaven de Nafal, once the star already fell, it's being found somewhere, Israel, so then already it's a star that essentially the star's reputation is ruined, so to speak, so therefore we have a concern. Maybe in this particular case, it happened to be that the star was written even though the malva was not around. And the Gemara continues, Abaya says, Eidav b'chasum of Zachenlo, the reason why you can write a star for the lova even though the malva is not present is because there is no concern that the loan is going to be later on, because the moment the Eidim sign, it's from that moment that there is a shibud. Ve'afilu shtari de lav hakna, that's true even if it's a star that's not a star hakna, automatically it is considered just to collect from the date on the star, because it goes by the time that the witness is signed. And the Gemara explains, Mishum de Kashale, the reason why Abaya said this is because he was bothered by the following question. Kevon de Amrit b'shtari de lav hakna, if you're already saying by a star that's not a star hakna, ki lesa l'malva b'hadei, if the malva is not there, lo kasvinan, we wouldn't write such a star, so leka l'mechash de ikri v'chasav, there never would be such a concern that maybe it happened to be written in this particular case, even by a star that fell, even by a star that was lost, that would not be a concern. And Rashi explains, Abaya says, Haditanan, that which we learned in the Mishnah, Kosvin star lalova below malva. Again, we said that you can write a star for the lova even though the malva is not present. So according to Abaya, afilu b'star de lav hakna nami, that's by all starus, even if it's a star that's not a star hakna. V'inami asi l'mitraf meha'idna, and even if you would collect from the date on the star, v'hulo lava at Tishrei, even if he didn't actually borrow the money until Tishrei, lo shalo kedinu, that's not a problem at all, that's not considered unjust. The Eida b'chasum of Zachenlo, because the Eidim from when they sign, they create the shibud. Miyom shechasmu zachin lo hashibud. That shibud is created from the day they sign. Ve'afilu lo hilva hamos ad Tishrei, even if the money was not lent until Tishrei. And the Gemara then continued and said, "Ulahachi mukele Abaye b'hai time." The reason why Abaye says this is mishum dekashale, because he was bothered by the following question: Kevan diamrit v'chulu. Again, once you've already said that when you have a situation of a shtar that's not a shtar hakna, if the malva is not there, you're not going to write it. So then that wouldn't be a concern. Aval hashta detanan. But now that we're saying that's not true, now that we're saying according to Abaye, kozvin, that you do write all shtaros, it doesn't matter if it's a shtar hakna, it doesn't matter if it's a shtar that's not a shtar hakna. Chayshin dil makasav lalavas v'lo lavas. So then already we can explain the Mishnah. There's a concern, maybe it was written and the loan didn't actually take place. However, as Rashi notes, that's not so simple. Because later on the Gemara will ask, well, if this is all true, what Abaye is saying, that there's no problem of writing the shtar for the lova, even though the malva is not there, it doesn't matter if it's a shtar hakna or not a shtar hakna. So then Amai lo yachzer. So then again, back to our Mishnah, why can't you return the shtar? Harei zachu lo edav b'chasuma v'shaper tarif. That we say that the moment the Edom signed, so then there is a shibud from that moment in time, and therefore you could collect from the lekuchos. So in other words, Abaye is explaining that it doesn't matter if it's a shtar hakna or not a shtar hakna. That makes no difference in terms of when the actual loan takes place. You're allowed to write the shtar whether the malva is there or not. But with that explanation, we then have a question: how do we explain our Mishnah? Why is it that you can't return such a shtar? There's no longer a concern, according to Abaye, that you'll collect from lekuchos shelo kedin. That the Gemara will address later on. And the Gemara continues, but that which we learned in the Mishnah, Matzah Gitei Nashim v'Shechrei Avodim. Let's say somebody finds Gitei Nashim, divorce documents, or Shechrei Avodim, which are documents to free slaves, or Daitaki. Rashi will explain that in a moment. Matana, let's say it's a shtar that's a shtar matana for a gift. V'Shovrim, let's say it's a shtar that's a shover, which is a shtar of a receipt. So in all of those situations, Hareza lo yachzer, the person should not return the shtaros. Shemak Suvim hayu v'nimlach alem shelo litnim, because again you have this concern, maybe they were written, but the person decided not to give those shtaros over. But the Gemara asks on that, but even if the person decided not to give the shtar, so according to Abaye, what difference does that make? You just said that right when the Edom signed the shtar, essentially from that point in time, the person is being meshavet himself. And the Gemara says to that, that's only true if it actually reached his hand. But in a situation where it did not reach his hand, then we would not say that the shtar takes effect that early. And Rashi explains daitiki, first of all, shtar daitiki is tzavos shchimira. That means a will. Somebody who's on his deathbed writes up this kind of a shtar. Veloshan daitiki dot tekus zos tekum the divrei shchimira kechsuvin b'chemesur and dami. The language of calling it a daitiki is because that which a shchimira, his words, whatever he says, is as if it's written and given over. And matana refers to matnas bari. That refers to a shtar that's a gift from a healthy person, not a person that's on his deathbed. Veshovrin is piron hashtar. Shovrin is like a receipt. It's a document that says that a shtar was paid off. And so again, the Gemara says, what's the concern? Don't we say Eda v'chasum of zachin lo? And the Gemara said to that, Hani mili hecha demot shtar liyade. That's only true when the shtar reaches his hand, meaning to say va'afilu la'achar zman. What it means is even if the shtar reaches him a little later, zachu lo chosmav ligvos mizman hakasabo. Still, the signatures from the time the date is written, that is going to be when the shibud starts. And so what the Gemara essentially is saying is that once the shtar reaches the hand of the creditor, and only once it reaches the hand of the creditor, then we say Eida b'chasum of zachin lo. And Rashi continues Vikasha, but if you'll ask the following, Hadetanan, what about that which we said in the Mishnah, Shtar echov hamukdamin pasulin, that let's say you have a predated shtar, that's puzzle, it's disqualified, v'hamucharin kasherin, but if it's post-dated, it's fine. The reason for that distinction is, again, if it's predated, you can collect from property, from lekuchos, from buyers, from the date on the shtar, and that's going to be shelo kedin, that's unjust. So b'may mukila Abaye, how does Abaye explain that Mishnah? Because it shouldn't be a problem at all. Eida b'chasum of zachin lo, as long as when they sign, that's the same as the date, that date is fine. And so that Rashi says, Taretz, that you can answer, but mukdemes ksivasan l'chasimasan. That's talking about a totally different case where the writing of the shtar actually took place before the signing of the shtar. It's not talking about the shtar taking place before the actual loan. That's not relevant when we say Eida b'chasum of zachin lo. It goes by the signature. But there would be an issue, let's say the signature is not on the same date as when the shtar was written. Now the date on the shtar is not the same as when it was signed. Eida b'chasum of zachin lo doesn't help in that case. Ulahachi psulin, that's why it's going to be disqualified. Shabalitrof mishas ksiva. He's trying to collect from the time it was written, not the time it was signed. Inami, or you can have shekasvu v'chasmu b'tishrei. Another case could be, let's say it was written and signed in Tishrei, v'hem kasvu b'socho Nisan, but they wrote into it the date of Nisan. They wrote the wrong date. Shu Rosh Hashanah l'shtaros, that's the Rosh Hashanah of shtaros. That could be another situation of predated, where Eida v'chasum of zachin lo is not going to help. And the Gemara continues, and this is the question that Rashi alluded to before. Elam Asnisan, but in terms of our Mishnah, the Katani Motza Shtari Chov, it says again in our Mishnah, if he finds a Shtar Chov, if there's a lien in that shtar, lien on property, so then he shouldn't return it. Vukim, then we said that what's the Mishnah talking about? It's talking Keshachayev Moda. It's talking when the Lova admits that he owes the money, so there's no problem fundamentally with the shtar, and so why can't you give it to the Malva? The reason is, the problem is, again, maybe it was written in Nisan, but the loan didn't take place until Tishrei, so then you have a problem of collecting from Lekuchos Shelo Kedin. And so the Gemara now asks, Bishlamel Ravasi. Now I understand according to Ravasi, Da'amar Bishtari Aknaisa, he says that when it says in the Mishnah that we're able to write a shtar for the lov when the Malva is not present, that's only by Shtari Aknaisa. So then Mukilo Bishtari Delav Aknaisa. So then we'll say again, as we said, our Mishnah is talking about shtaros that are not Shtari Aknaisa, and therefore you really do have this problem. You have a problem because the collection from the Lekuchos is going to be from the date on the shtar, but really you shouldn't be collecting from Lekuchos until the time of the actual loan. And that's all, like we said before, according to Ravasi. Elali Abaya, but according to Abaya, again, Abaya says that any time the witnesses sign the shtar, as long as the shtar actually did reach the creditor, we say that it goes from the time of the signature, and therefore you're justly collecting from the lekuchos. So then what's the issue over here? There's no concern. Why not just return this shtar to the creditor? And the Gemara says to that, Amar Loch Abaya, Abaya will say to you, the way he understands the Mishnah is, Masnisan Hainu Time, the reason of our Mishnah is, Dechayesh Lepiron V'Leknunya. What he's actually concerned about is that this loan was actually paid off, and this is a conspiracy between the lender and the borrower to try to take property from the Lekuchos, from the purchasers. And Rashi explains, Lepiron v'leknunya, again, we're talking about a concern of Piron and Knunya, meaning Shema Paro. Maybe what happened was as follows. The borrower actually paid off the loan. Umin halova nafal, the borrower had actually gotten back his shtar. It fell from the lova, and therefore the borrower owed nothing. V'hadu kamod, and the only reason that the lova is admitting, the admission is nothing. The reason why he's admitting, and he's saying lo parat, he's saying I didn't pay, when really he did pay. Eitzahi beineim shel ramos, this is a conspiracy between him and the malva. Litrof as alaku. What they're really just trying to do is collect from the lekuchos, because some purchasers bought property from him, and so now the lova is trying to claim he didn't pay off the loan when he really did, and therefore he's trying to say now the lender is allowed to collect from those who purchased property from him. That's actually the concern over here. It's a concern of this kind of a conspiracy. That's why you don't return such a shtar. And the Gemara continues, V'lishmuel da'amar, but what about according to Shmuel, who says, Lo chashinon lepiron v'leknunya, that we don't have such a concern that a document, a shtar, was already paid off and there's a conspiracy going on, that we don't say, once the lova admits according to Shmuel that he owes the money, we assume he really does owe the money. So Ma'ikal Meimar, so how is Shmuel going to understand our Mishnah? And Hanicha yisavar like Ravasi, now of course it works out if Shmuel holds like Ravasi, Diyamar b'shtari hakna, who again says that you can write a shtar for the lova when the malva is not present only by shtari hakna. Muki Maslis exactly like we said, he'll simply say that our Mishnah is talking about shtaros that are not shtari hakna, and therefore again there is such a concern that the shtar was written but the date is actually too early because the loan took place later. But if Shmuel holds like Abaya of the concept of Eida b'chasum of Zachinlo, so that's not a concern, because from the moment of the signatures already you're allowed to collect from the lekuchos. So what are you going to say according to Shmuel? There really is no concern, because you can't have a concern of a conspiracy either according to Shmuel. And so the Gemara says for Shmuel muki l'masnisin k'she'ein chayev modeh. Shmuel will simply say the Mishnah is talking about a case where the lova actually does not admit that it is a good shtar. The lova is not admitting that he owes the money, and that's why you shouldn't return it. But the Gemara says according to that, so let's say there is no achrayis nechasim. Let's say there is no shibud in the shtar. Why should you return such a shtar? You don't know that any money is owed. What difference does it make if there's a lien on the property or not? Granted that such a shtar can't collect from property with a lien on it, but still you can use a shtar to collect from the free property, and that wouldn't be right in such a case over here because the lova is not admitting that he owes any money. So why are we returning the shtar in such a case? And the Gemara says, Mikva Gavi, again, from free property you can certainly collect. And so the Gemara answers to that, Shmuel Latayme. Shmuel is following his reasoning, his opinion. Diyamar Shmuel, because Shmuel says, Omer Haya Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir would say, Shtar Chov she'ein bo achrayis nechasim, that if you have a shtar chov and there's no lien for that shtar chov, ein go velomi meshavdi velomi bnei chori. It's a completely useless shtar. You can't collect from property with a lien. You can't collect collect from free property as well. And so the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, well, if the star is totally useless and you can't collect anyway, which is the reason why you can return such a star, but why bother even returning the star? There's nothing you can do with that star. And the Gemara says to that, Amar Rabbi Nasan Baroshia says, the lender can use it even though it can't be used as a star, it can just be used as a piece of paper. You can use it to cover up a flask. You can use it as a cap for a flask. The Gemara says, well, if that's the case, why not give it to the borrower, let him use it as a cap, to use it over his pitcher? And the Gemara says, Lova, who no, the Lova is the one, as the Gemara will go on to say, the Lova is saying that this is really a nothing star, that he doesn't owe any money, so therefore you're not going to return it to him. And Rashi explains, V'lishmuel damar l'kamon, according to Shmuel, it says later on, lo chashin l'piron, we don't have such a concern that it was paid off. B'shtar hanimtza, meaning anytime you find a star, you're not concerned it was paid. V'afilu ein chayev mod, even in a situation where the lova is not admitting that he's chayev, demisa depari, because according to Shmuel, we assume that if it was paid off, mikra have a karle, it certainly would be torn up completely. The fact that it's around, according to Shmuel, that's evidence this was not paid, and he owes the money. Damar Shmuel l'kamon, Shmuel says this later on, hamotzi shtar hakna b'shuk yachzer l'baylim v'kol shkein k'shchayev moda, and Rashi says certainly that's going to be true if the lova admits that he's chayiv. You're certainly not going to say it's a conspiracy, because in general you assume it was not paid off. Mehai time agufa, for the same reason. To miyom priyasahu kora, from the moment that he pays it off, he's going to tear it up. So there's no concern of a conspiracy. What is Shmuel going to say? And Rashi continues, Hanicha, the Gemara said it's good if Shmuel holds like Ravasi, so then we can understand the Mishnah. The Mishnah is talking about a star that is not a star hakna, and the reason why you can't return the star to the creditor is because there's a concern maybe it was written in Nisan, and the loan didn't take place until Tishrei. However, if Shmuel follows Abaye, who says Eida b'chasum of Zachenlo, so then we say from the moment of the signature you're really able to collect. So again, why can't you return the star to the creditor? And Rashi asks Vikash if you can ask the following question. Al karchach lo svir like Abaye. It's impossible for Shmuel to hold like Abaye. The Ika Abaye svir, because if he holds like Abaye, my ir yashtar hakna. What do you have to talk about shtar hakna? Meaning we said before in the previous Rashi that Shmuel is going to say later on, Hamotzi shtar hakna b'shuk. If somebody finds a shtar hakna b'shuk, yachzer l'baylim, that you always return to the original owner. And that's obvious, because if it's a shtar hakna, so that means that from the moment the shtar is written, the lova is obligating himself regardless of whether there's a loan or not. Even if there is no loan whatsoever, it's hakna, he's saying he's obligated anyway. And again, Shmuel is not concerned with piron, he's not concerned that it was already paid off, he's not concerned with kanunya, with any kind of conspiracy, and so therefore, of course, by a shtar hakna, you're going to return to the creditor. But my area shtar hakna, what do you have to even talk about a shtar hakna? According to Abaya, there is no difference between a shtar hakna and a shtar that's not a shtar hakna, because Eida b'chasum of Zachenlo says from the moment of the signature there's an obligation. There's really no difference. Why would you think that suddenly, according to Abaya, by a shtar that's not a shtar hakna, there's a possibility? Even if it's a shtar that's not a shtar hakna, of course Shmuel is going to say you return to the creditor. Because Shmuel is not concerned that it was already paid off, and Eida b'chasum of Zachenlo, from the moment they sign, there's an obligation. And so therefore, what's the Gemara even doing over here to say that there's a possibility that Shmuel can go like Abaya? And so Rashi says to that, Lav Pirchahi, that's not a question at all. Demoda Abaya, because Abaya would admit, B'delo mata shtar liyade. Let's say you have the following scenario. Let's say you have a scenario where the shtar is written and it's signed, but it never gets to the malva at all. Kedaman, like we said earlier, in that case you don't say Eida b'chasum of Zachenlo, meaning to say essentially there was no loan. If you had a situation where you wrote up the shtar and there was no loan whatsoever, so Abaya would say that's not the same as a shtar hakna. A shtar hakna is saying that no matter what happens, whether there's a loan or not, the lova is saying he's obligated. That's not true in a case of a shtar that's not a shtar hakna with Eida b'chasum of Zachenlo. If the shtar never gets to the malva, so then of course you're going to say that he's not going to be obligated. So hilkach ikol amemar, that's why according to Abaya there's this possibility. Therefore there's a possibility of saying kasav lalavos v'lo lava lagamri. Maybe it was written to borrow with, but then there was no borrowing whatsoever. There was no loan. V'lo mata liyadei me'olam, it never got to his hands. And as the Bach over here adds, Divrei Hamaschel Hanicha Hilka Chikol Amemar Nir Betzido Perish Kashein Chayiv Moda. Exactly what the Gemara is about to go on to say. You could have a situation where the Lova does not admit. He says there was no loan. Now by a Shtar Hakna, that doesn't make sense. He obligates himself in any case. But by a situation of a Shtar that's not a Shtar Hakna, you can have a situation of Ein Chayiv Moda. Again, as the Gemara goes on to say, in such a situation, there you would not return the Shtar. And finally, Rashi says, Shmuel Muki Lo Kashein Chayiv Moda. Shmuel says our Mishnah is talking about where the Lova does not admit that he is Chayiv. He doesn't admit to the writing of the shtar. Sha'omer lova lo kasafti mezuyif, the lova says again that I didn't write it, that it's forged, and it's for that reason that you're not returning the shtar to the creditor. And so the Gemara then asks, well, if that's the case, by a star that doesn't have achrayas nechasim also, you should not return it to the creditor because we're assuming the star is no good. And the Gemara said to that according to Rabbi Meir, a star with no achrayas nechasim you can't use anyway. You can't use it to collect from nechasim meshubadim or from nechasim b'nei chor, and you can't collect it all, so it's no concern. And again, the idea is therefore you're just returning it in order that the malva can use it to put on top of his flask. And Rashi says, V'im Tomer, now if you're going to ask, is Kayim b'chosma, well, why don't we have a simple solution? If the lova says it was forged, let's just certify it by the signatures. And Rashi says to that, Kevan Shanafal Israel, once it fell, it's already lost, and it was found, it was retrieved, so then Israel, it's considered a bad star. We just assume that since it was a disqualified star, he wasn't careful with it. We therefore believe what this guy is saying, and getting it certified is not going to be a solution. We believe that the star might not be a good star. We will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yomi Gemara Amud Beis.